Welcome back. This is our second video, and in this video we will be talking about research methods, but I just wanted to do a little bit of review before we started that. So just a reminder that when we talk about family, family may be a biological term, it may be a legal term, or it may be an emotional term. So who you consider family might be someone that you are biologically related to, or someone that you are related to in terms of the law, like someone that you have married or adopted. And family also might be considered an emotional term. So somebody that you care so much about that you consider them family, although they are not biologically or legally related to you. Someone that maybe you call them uncle or auntie. And we are using these definitions in this course for defining families. So families are groups of related people bound by connections that are biological, legal, or emotional. And families is a societal construct whereby people are related by ancestry, marriage, adoption, or choice. So family is a social form, but also a cultural symbol. And here's your first quiz question. So we consider family a thing, but also an emotional state with symbolic meaning attached to it. So in question 1, it asks, which of the following definitions of family is best according to the lecture? Family is a thing, family is an important cultural symbol, or family is a feeling or emotional state. The answer is all three. Family is a thing, a feeling, and an important cultural symbol. When we look at families, or when we think about families in ideal terms, we still look at families in terms of what we've called in this course the standard North American family, sort of this 1950s suburban image of a dad who comes home holding his hat from work, to a sparkling clean house, and a wife who's wearing a heart-shaped apron, and 2 kids who are eating homemade cookies and drinking some sort of soda with a lot of food in the fridge. Everybody's smiling, there's no problems, there are no socioeconomic difficulties, the family is intact, they are opposite sex parents. So this is sort of the stereotypical image, or what we call the standard North American family. And as I mentioned before, this is not really a very accurate depiction of most families, or the way that we see them these days. So I want to begin talking about research methods. So in any sociology course, we always want to talk about the research methods that we would use to study families, because in sociology, we don't just theorize about families or conceptualize them. We always test our conceptualizations and theories by doing research. And so the research methods are very important for studying marriage and families. So I wanted to just give you a brief overview of the tools used to study marriage and family. So I've listed here a couple of tools used by historians to study families and some sociological tools. So the first tool used by historians to study families is called family reconstitution. And in this type of research method, in order to learn about a family or a family member, every scrap of data on a particular person's life is collected to reconstruct their life. So this historian might look at diaries, grocery lists, letters, date books, medical records, phone book records. I just got finished completing a family reconstitution of one of my family members, my great-grandfather. And by the way, that's the answer to question 3. I see I need to go back and answer question 2. But for question 3, your instructor engaged in family constitution research recently, which is of her family members was the main subject of her research. And the answer is great-grandfather, the second one. I did a project on my great-grandfather who was born in 1873, so that was a long time ago. It was very difficult to find his records, but I used all of the records that I just mentioned, but in addition to them, I used ship manifests for the ships that he came to America on. I used what were called city directories before there were phone books. They were kind of like phone books before there were phones. I used birth certificates and just anything I could find, newspaper articles, anything that I could find on my great-grandfather to learn more about his life. Another type of tools that historians used to look at families is called aggregate data analysis. And this is when they gather historical records from different points in time to see trends. So they don't look at individuals or individual families like I did, but rather they look at large populations to see if families have changed over time. So an example of that would be using census data. So as I'm sure you all are aware, the United States Census is taken every 10 years, and we have one coming up in 2020, and there was one in 2010. And so historians looking at family, I think sociologists could do this too, but historians looking at changes in family forms might look at how many children families had in 1900, say, compared to 2000, 100 years later. And they might be able to see some trends by looking at these large data sets and not at individual people. Sociologists use surveys, interviews, and observations to study families, and they use others too, but we'll focus on these today. So surveys are the most common method used by sociologists to study any topic. The reason that it's so commonly used is that it's fast, it's inexpensive, it's accurate, but there are costs to using surveys as well because they are not in depth. You can't really go in depth with people. So you ask them to answer a question like a multiple choice question, and then they give you the answer, but you can't really go back and ask them more later or ask them to give you open-ended answers. For more in-depth information, you would use interviews or observational methods. So interviews and observations are both methods where you're able to spend more time asking questions and delving into the meaning of each situation. So interviewing, you sit down one-on-one with a person. If you use more than one person, it's usually called a focus group, and you can have a conversation. In interviews, in order to keep it rigorous and systematic, you would devise questions in advance and try to stick to your questions, but not stick to them to the point of inflexibility. So if the person you're interviewing starts talking about something that's really interesting that you didn't think of when you were writing your questions, you don't stop them. You let them keep talking because it's interesting. I conducted, when I was an undergraduate like you guys, I did a really interesting study on family in New Mexico, where I went to college. I found a small ghost town in New Mexico, and I was really fascinated by this ghost town. I walked in and I wondered who lived here. I hope you guys know what a ghost town is. It's like an abandoned town where nobody lives anymore. And this town, like all the houses were kind of crumbling and some had fallen in. So it had been a long time since anybody had lived there. And I just was really curious to find out who lived there and what their life was like. And so I used this ghost town for a project for one of my classes. This was called the Oral History Project. And I actually found people who had lived there and I interviewed them one-on-one. And it was a really fantastic experience, and I learned a lot about this town and what life was like there by interviewing the people that had lived there, these older people that I found. So the point is, I could go into great depth, but I had no idea what these people were going to bring up. And they, for instance, they brought up how they would go dancing. They would dance in the town. And that wasn't on my list of questions, but I definitely wanted to know about that, so I let them run with it. Observational methods are divided into two types. There are participant and non-participant observation type methods. So participant observation is when you take part in in whatever activity your research subjects are in. So let's say you wanted to study people at an amusement park. You wouldn't just sit there and watch other people at the amusement park. You would go on all the rides too, and you would talk to them there. Maybe you would know the people, but you're a participant in what's going on and not just an outsider. So that's one type of observational method. The other type is non-participant observation, which is what I'm asking you to do this week for your research project. You want to study people in their natural setting as unobtrusively as possible. So you try to stand aside and just observe people and not disturb whatever they're doing. And if they want to know what you're doing, you be honest with them and tell them. Or you might even in the very beginning walk up to people and introduce yourself and explain that you're a researcher. But your being there has an effect on what happens with the research. But this is a really wonderful method for being able to watch people in their natural settings and see what they really act like without any kind of pretense. So that's it for the research methods video, and the next one will be on theory.